that corruption that you talk about, that deep corruption after the coup in 2009, really resulted in what your piece centers around, the development of these basically economic development zones. We have versions of that here in the U.S., opportunity zones and tax breaks that go to corporations to invest in this. And we covered this under the Trump administration, how, it was very glad handy and also not necessarily providing the the community investment that it purported to. That is like peanuts compared to the level of devastation that these zones created in Honduras through these corrupt leaders. Talk a bit about these zones. They're called ZEDEs, I believe. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right, but what are they? How did they come to be? And how do they fit into the current political situation in Honduras?
Yeah, so these ZEDEs, which we usually use the sort of term in Spanish, ZEDEs, but they're basically, as you said, special economic zones. And you're right, there's a long history of this. Actually, going back, you can go way back. You can go back to how the Brits used to administer their empire with the East Asia Company. They're like not having direct state control, but having essentially corporations or boards of corporations, private entities running territories as if that territory was their own private state, right? So, there's been lots of examples. Some special economic zones have had varying degrees of success. If you look at the history of China, the famous one is Shenzhen there, which the Chinese were able to sort of create this kind of free trade zone on their coast, and through that to get some investment, and then to sort of use that as a launching pin for the rest of for the modernization of their economy. So, there are some cases that are sometimes heralded as success stories to justify all the others. I think the success stories are few and far between, and the success stories are always accompanied by a strong state sort of looking at what's going on there, and then sort of either eventually taking control or replicating certain practices, but not this is not the case of Honduras, right? The Honduras case is one of the most extreme cases of privatization of space. So not just a tax-free zone, but an area in which corporations basically have absolute autonomy. So much so that they have their own courts, they have their own security services, they have basically their own sovereignty over a chunk of territory, which the Honduran state then cannot sort of meddle in or exert any type of sovereignty in. I think most scholars who study these free ports, free trade zones that have different names around the world, sort of recognize that the Honduran Zede is the most, fundamentalist expression of this.
Wow.
Now, how did it come about? Well, it came about exactly because of the level of corruption that was, tolerated, and I would say encouraged by some large corporations after the coup. So after the coup, a number of corporations approached the Honduran state, and there are some negotiations in order to create these ZEDEs. The first attempt is barred by the Honduran Constitutional Court, which says, wait a minute, this is taking away, territory from Honduran jurisdiction. This is unconstitutional. We cannot have that. So eventually, one of the coup governments gets rid of the Constitutional Court, which stands in the way, and replaces the Constitutional Court by another Constitutional Court with all sorts of judges that are friendly to this process of privatizing Honduran land and giving away to these corporations, the ZEDEs. So you can see here that these corporations have been accompanying the process all along, for over a period of 10 years, until finally they get these ZEDEs passed, and they get given this piece of land to sort of play with and create their own. The word charter city is often used. A city which they can basically run. And a lot of these investors are sort of Silicon Valley libertarians. I mean, this is kind of a little bit of a simplification, but I think it really embodies the kind of investors that you're seeing, who have this kind of dream of charter cities. Startup cities are often words that are also used, in which they're not going to be hampered by state or regulations or taxes or anything like that, and they're basically going to be able to run these private cities for the benefit of their investors, of course, but with a certain utopia in mind, right? The idea is to really show the world that the state is the problem, and that if you have these shining cities that are run by these corporations, it's going to create wealth. And there are a few other cities like that. I mean, a few Bitcoin cities as well in El Salvador and
right.
So it's part of that family, and it is. Is what happened in Honduras. I mean, 3 such places, 3 such ZEDEs were created. The biggest one and the most powerful one by far, created on Honduras's largest Caribbean island, an island called Roatan, which is a very idyllic Caribbean island, where there's lots of tourism, basically for scuba diving purposes. And the idea is to give a large chunk of this beautiful, pristine island to these investors, so that they then can build this shining modern city to do all sorts of economic activities, including some stuff which usually is heavily regulated, including in the United States. In the field of genetics, in the field of bioscience, where there's quite a lot of regulation. So there's some suspicion there as well that, this is a way of doing things without much ethics involved, and without much.
That's so creepy. I mean, it really is this libertarian, vision that you describe, and one that, unfortunately we are seeing in El Salvador. But this is just carving up Honduras to give to U.S. investors and capitalists, regardless of the displacement that it creates, or regardless of the scarcity of resources that it engenders when you just decide to give away parts of your country to rich guys so they can do their little weird experiments. And there's really, based on your piece, not shockingly, I guess, when you realize who's writing these laws and stuff, but there's very few mechanisms for recourse, for challenging them in any meaningful way. Can you talk a little bit about that impact?
Yeah, I mean, in Honduran law, basically, it means the state of Honduras does not have a say on a aspect of on a key part of its territory, right? It's basically a complete loss of sovereignty on behalf of the Honduran state. It almost amounts to saying that this chunk of territory isn't Honduras anymore, right? I mean, it's pretty serious. I mean, there's a real sort of colonial dimension or neo-colonial dimension to this, right? And so it's unsurprising that, first, several Honduran institutions, I mean, I just mentioned the Constitutional Court said, no, this is not okay. And then they were sort of pushed out. And then you've had a lot of civil society organizations. There was various civil society organizations, in fact, came together, including indigenous movement. I mean, that the region where the largest ZED is being constructed is in the Caribbean, so mostly sort of Afro-Caribbean organizations as well getting involved to protest this. Typically also and arrogantly, the corporation arriving on the land that it's been adjudicated, it's been basically given to create this new state, and then also starting to have a conflictive relationship with the local inhabitants, right? Local inhabitants first being told there's going to be a big sort of touristic resort built on their land, and then little by little they realize that the land's being gated, the land's being privatized, social services are now being privatized. There was a big problem with access to water. So starting very soon, you see the ZEDEs starting to have real, tangible impacts on local inhabitants, and local inhabitants fighting back, protesting, and this coming to, I mean, basically people saying, no, we don't want to be, we're Hondurans, don't want to be part of this crazy
right.
or dystopian process.
Yeah, utopian for the capitalists there, but like I mean the what's also interesting to me too is that the current president, the first female president ever of Honduras, Castro, is ran in opposition to these. So it's become quite politically salient within Honduras and has, as a kind of a center leftist, vowed to take them on. And it seems as though there is like an international kind of court system, the ICSID that you write about, I believe, where there's arbitration and potential for some sort of recourse. And even the United States, like Elizabeth Warren, has spoken out in opposition to these kinds of zones and ZEDEs in this instance. What is the status of Honduras's efforts under this new president, fairly new president, to push back against this?
So you're absolutely right. I mean, the current president, who's sworn in 2022, the first female president of Honduras on a broadly sort of left of center platform, campaigned in 2021 against these ZEDEs. I mean, the no to the ZEDEs, literally, that was the slogan, was featured quite prominently in her campaign, right? So when she arrived in power, she said, okay, now we're going to dismantle these ZEDEs. First of all, they were unconstitutional and corrupt and all these things we just discussed. And secondly, this was a key message in my campaign, and therefore people have voted for this, and we're going to dismantle this. And surprisingly, Congress voted unanimously in favor of repealing the ZEDEs law. Even opposition parties, some of them had actually been in favor of the ZEDEs, I think started coming to terms that this was unacceptable, that the Honduran electorate had voted massively against this, that this was extremely unpopular. And in her, let's say, early months in power, in the honeymoon period, she got this unanimous parliamentary vote against the ZEDEs and repealed the law. But the investors have said what you've just presented, and they've said, but we are going to take you to court now to this thing called ICSID, which is an international investment state dispute settlement mechanisms, of which there are many in the world. This is quite techie, but I think it's good for your audience to understand, very broadly speaking, what it means. These are arbitration mechanisms when a state and a corporation have a dispute. So when states and investors have disputes, there are treaties that are signed between states that these disputes are not settled in the courts of the countries where the investment happens. This was one of the big things of the sort of neoliberal heyday of the 80s and 90s, I would say, of the Washington Consensus. We often talk a lot about, the privatization, the rolling back the state, the putting an end to the large state. But one of the things, and free trade agreements and all these things, people, I think, and deregulation, people understand this. But what sometimes people don't understand, this came hand in hand with investment state dispute settlement mechanism, what is often called, it's very jargony, but it's called ISDS, right? Investment state dispute settlement mechanism. And these are basically treaties that were signed particularly between states, developing countries in the global south, and countries like the United States or European, but also the Chinese and so on. And the idea was, you will get US investment, but first you sign this treaty here so that if there is a problem, then we don't go to your courts in Honduras or we don't go to your courts in Guatemala, we'll go to an arbitration court. And these arbitration courts, of course, are in Paris and London and Washington. This one in particular, ICSID, is attached to the World Bank, and it is therefore in Washington, DC. Now, these arbitration mechanisms are terrible, because first of all, the state cannot win, and the state cannot take the investor to court. It's always the investor that takes the state to court. I mean, if the state wins, if you like, it's because it hasn't lost. But, in 35% of the cases that are taken to arbitration, the state doesn't actually lose. But in 65% of the cases, the investor wins, and the investor often wins very big. So in this case, against Honduras, the investor's claiming, Honduras is in breach of its investment treaties because we signed these treaties. The United States signed these treaties. So there are several of them, but they're appealing to one that is in CAFTA, the Central American Free Trade Agreement. And by closing down the CEDEs and by repealing the CEDEs law, Honduras is in breach of that. Therefore, Honduras has to pay the company in Roatan, the Zede, 10.7 billion in compensation. Now, 10.7 billion in compensation is a third of Honduran GDP. Honduran GDP is around 29 billion. It's also 2/3 of Honduras' state budget, right? So these are huge amounts, which would clearly make Honduras bankrupt, based on these treaties that have been signed. Now, we'll have to see how the arbitration case goes. How it goes. It's quite likely that the judges think, no, this is outrageous.
Well, let me ask this then, because I mean, how can they make that determination based on the fact that I guess if looking at the contract, right? The technically they do maybe owe this corporation money, but it was written under corrupt pretenses. Literally, these presidents who wrote these laws, like one of them sitting in a jail right now. So why does that not play into the contractual dispute in an arbitration?
Yeah, the problem is that these arbitration courts, tribunals, this one you mentioned, ICSID, which is attached to the World Bank, are not really run by judges, right? It's not they're not lawyers. Or rather, they are lawyers, but they're corporate lawyers.
Right.
So they're kind of private courts. And, with a strong culture of benefiting investment, because investment is the deity of these arbitration courts, right? So investors are the good guys, the states are the evil predators who are trying to nationalize investment and all. So there's a strong cultural prejudice there, which is why it's rare that a state wins. They never win economically. Sometimes they do not lose, as I've just explained, but it usually goes, it usually favors investors. So this is the great fear. Now, that's one of the problems. The other scandalous problem, I think, is that a lot of these court cases or arbitration cases are based on the loss of future profits. So actually, if you go to the Zede itself on the island of Roatan, there's nothing. The company that's running the Zede has built 3-4 buildings there. They've started building, but it's mostly gated area which is yet to be developed. So what they're taking Honduras to court for almost $11 billion is loss of future profits.
Future profits, right?
Yeah, it's incredible.
It's incredible.
Yeah. So I think this is a particular egregious case of ISDS. ISDS is resisted, by the way, all over the world right now. Europeans are departing the Energy Charter Treaty en masse. Why? Because the Energy Charter Treaty, which has these arbitration mechanisms, is basically preventing European states from doing the energy transition, from moving away from fossil fuel. Why? Because same problem, right?
Loss of future profits.
Yeah. Well, you close down a coal mine for environmental purposes, and then the coal investors take you to court because there's an investment treaty here, right? So a lot of European countries saying, "Oh, this is taking this a bit far," where they're moving away from the Energy Charter Treaty. You had both the Trump and the Biden administration in the United States also saying some of these arbitration courts are too strong. So you're seeing the advanced economies moving away, but of course, as usual, they're applying this kind of do as I say, not what as I do policies and double standards. And so you're still seeing a number of kind of wealthy countries kind of bullying developing countries, saying, if you want investment from my country, from my capitalists in your country, then you have to sign these arbitration clause here. So going back to what you were saying about this is where the debate is at in Washington. Some people are saying, wait a minute, we're saying we don't want this anymore because it's preventing the energy transition, it's preventing the fight against climate change, but then we're imposing this on countries such as Honduras, which is where the battle's at right now.
Exactly. And just to give people a sense, like this actually is a market shift in thinking in Washington. thankfully the TPP failed, but it had similar tribunal framework for corporations that would be able to supersede the sovereignty of other countries if losses were to be incurred by that corporation. I mean, that was one of the more controversial Trans-Pacific Partnership elements as well, that why Obama got a ton of criticism for it, as he should have, right? And now there is at least a small, I think, shift in the thinking, because it's like wait, we have handed way too much power to these capitalists, and the fact that they're superseding national sovereignty, now that it's coming back to bite maybe bigger players in Europe and white people in the ass, then now we have a problem with it, essentially.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, it started, actually, it was the Global South that did start it, so we should give them credit. The South Africans were the first, then India, then Indonesia, then Ecuador, then Venezuela. Several countries in the Global South start saying, well, we're leaving our... So there are various mechanisms, but the most common ones are bilateral investment treaties. So treaties between two countries that agree that if there's investment, we won't go to the courts of either country, we'll go to these arbitration courts. So a number of countries doing that. But then you're right, it did start... the EU was a big one, right? Because incredibly, the EU is still today the most regulated space on earth, right? So it's still the place on the world where you have the most amount of labor regulations and environmental regulations and so on and so forth, right? So incredibly, you started having cases of EU states being taken to court in Washington, D.C., in ICSID, this World Bank tribunal, by investors. So there was a famous case with Bulgaria, an EU country, being taken to court in Washington simply for upholding European law, right? European labor law, European environmental law, but because there was a bilateral investment treaty with the United States, the investors was able to say, I don't care whether there's a law. It's not my problem. My problem is you've changed the conditions of the contract. And that is unacceptable. So that created a backlash in the EU. One of the previous EU presidents of the Commission, Juncker, started saying, "Well, this is not right. This is going against the EU." And we are at a place. We are in a stage now where there are a number of sort of almost right-wing politicians that are saying this is not great. But it's easier for them to, it's often the case that they defend that for their own countries, so for EU countries, but you still see a number of EU presidents, prime ministers, foreign ministers visiting African states, and I just wrote another piece on this actually, saying, okay, we're leaving the Energy Charter Treaty because we can't tackle climate change by being members, but you should definitely sign the Energy Charter Treaty, because otherwise our investors are not going to be protected and you're not going to get investment. So you do get these huge double standards in ISDS still, with a lot of countries from the Global South sort of signing ISDS treaties because they're so desperate for foreign investment, basically.